Alright, sadly for all of you Anthrax fans, I'm not the biggest fan of this band. I don't think they are bad, but I do find them to be pretty mediocre for the most part. Don't get me wrong though, Dan Spitz is an amazing guitarist, and Charlie Benanti is a fantastic drummer. He's really good with the double bass, but sadly this band mostly doesn't have the music that really resonates with me like other bands. There are only really 2 albums I really like from them, the rest is either pretty mediocre or not very good. So let's get started. This album isn't very good, but I fucking love John Bush. He is a really good vocalist and I find him to be a great replacement of Joey Belladonna. In fact, I think he is better. I just love his more aggressive style, and I also love him in Armored Saint, so I already have a good reason to like the Bush era of Anthrax. But this album isn't great. I find it to be really stupid. It doesn't know what it wants to be. You get either some new metal, alternative rock, more poppy sounding songs, and believe it or not country. This is a very disjointed album, and the songs aren't very strong either. The songs are either just pretty boring or just bad, but there are some decent tracks on here. The best tracks are Born Again Idiot and Catharsis. So overall, this album is pretty boring and not very good at all. Ignore this one. I'm not also a big fan of this album either. I just find it to be pretty boring and uninspired. It's not stupid and disjointed like Volume 8 was, but I still am not a huge fan of this one. I feel like this album lacks on the heavier moments. There are a lot more softer and poppier tracks on here, and I just wish there were more fast and heavy songs like in Stump 442. Now this album isn't bad. It's definitely likable, but I find it very mediocre. The only song I really like off of here is the first song, What Doesn't Die. It's really the only fast and heavy song off here. Overall, I don't really like this album very much, but it's definitely more appealing than Volume 8. I'm not really a fan of the newer albums from Anthrax, not saying they are bad. They are definitely likable, especially if you are a huge Anthrax fan, but I never really liked these albums a lot. The main reason being that I don't really get them. They sound like 2 different things. Some of it sounds like they're more old school stuff, but there are elements that sound like Avenged Sevenfold, believe it or not. That sound doesn't fit with Anthrax in my opinion. It's what really turns me away from these albums. Worship Music is an okay album. There are some good songs like I'm Alive and The Devil You Know. But overall the rest of this album doesn't really reach me. I just don't find it that interesting, but it is more enjoyable than We've Come For You All and Volume 8. This is definitely a likable album. For All Kings is mostly the same as Worship Music, but it's definitely better. I like more songs off of here. It's definitely more heavy, and it has some elements of power metal. I really like some of the riffs off of here, and I like that this album has more faster and heavier moments. It's definitely an improvement, but it still has some more forgettable songs I don't really care about, especially in the second half. But this album has some tracks that I find are highlights from the albums with Joey Belladonna. The best tracks are You Gotta Believe, Breathing Lightning, Zero Tolerance, and the best track Evil Twin. Overall, this album is definitely an improvement from Worship Music, and it has some pretty good tracks, but this album isn't very consistent or flawless, there being some filler, but this album is still enjoyable. Persistence of Time is easily the weakest album from the classic era of Anthrax. I just find this one to be pretty boring, especially in the first half. Maybe except for Keep It in the Family, those songs I find to be really long and boring. I know this album is a more dark direction for them, but I don't think it works well. The guitar work and musicality doesn't reach me very much. I only really like the second half of this album, because they sound a little more like classic Anthrax, and they are not very long. I especially like the songs Got the Time, Discharge, and Belly of the Beast. Overall, this album isn't bad, but there are a lot of moments that feel dragged on and are just boring. The production also isn't very great, but there are some great songs on here. It's a fine album, but I really only listen to the highlights off of here. You guys are probably gonna get pissed, but oddly enough I actually like this album. I know why this is one of the worst ones. Just look at that album cover, it just screams shit, but I think there are good songs on here. Take the faster songs from We've Come For You All and Sound of White Noise and you get most of this album. There are some alternative and new metal elements all over here, but most of these tracks are pretty upbeat and catchy. The riffs are good, and John Bush does a great performance. This album also features Dimebag Darrell playing lead guitar on a few songs. There are some great songs on here like Random Acts of Senseless Violence, Fueled, and my favorite song would have to be Riding Shotgun. Overall, this is a pretty good album. My problem with it is that it is kinda stupid like Volume 8 was. There are a few bad songs on here, but overall this is a good and underrated album. State of Euphoria definitely isn't bad. In fact, it's quite good. But everything I don't like about 80s Anthrax, it's on this album. Now I do like crossover thrash. DRI is really good, but Anthrax aren't the best at doing crossover in my opinion. My main issues with 80s Anthrax is that the songs do get quite repetitive and annoying, and I feel like it's most annoying on this album. There is barely any variety on this album, and most tracks are pretty repetitive, having a lot of chorus repeats. It gets annoying on some songs like Out of Sight Out of Mind, Misery Loves Company, and Antisocial, but that's really the only issues with this album. The guitar work is awesome, the drumming is really good, and the soloing is amazing. The songs I like the most off of here would be Make Me Laugh, Finale, and Be All and All is a really great song. Probably my favorite Anthrax song with Joey Belladonna. Overall, this album is good, but it suffers from lack of variety and repetition, but there are some great tracks on here. Spreading the Disease is definitely a lot better than State of Euphoria, but it still has some major issues. First of all, the production is really bad. I don't know how you can make your production sound worse than your first album, and there are also 2 songs on here I cannot stand. Stand or Fall and Aftershock are terrible songs and I find them to be extremely annoying, but everything else on here is pretty good. This album easily has Joey Belladonna's best performance, and there is a bit more variety on here than State of Euphoria. The guitar work is fantastic. This is just a good album. The best tracks are AIR, Gung Ho, Medusa, and the best track on here is easily Armed and Dangerous. You know why that's the best song on the album? Because the best member of the goddamn band, Neil Turbin, wrote it. More on him later, but this album is pretty great. I like the more melodic flair to it and I like the variety. I'm just not a fan of the production and the 2 annoying filler tracks. Among the Living is a really good album. There is a reason why people say this is the best Anthrax album and one of the best thrash metal albums. It's really aggressive. The riffs and solos are great, and the drumming is the best performance from Charlie Benanti. I pretty much like every song on here, but I don't think this album is as good as everyone else says it is. I do find this album to be pretty repetitive, just like in State of Euphoria, but definitely not as bad. There's also not much variety on here. Some songs do feel similar to one another, but I still like this album quite a bit. The best tracks on here would have to be One World, I Am the Law, Indians, and the best track would have to be Imitation of Life.
You get to meet who are. Just say your name and you'll go far. I'm your friend, I think you should. Just say your name, it's real good. How many times have you heard this today? Come on, let's say it. Let's do it.
Among the Living is definitely the best Joey Belladonna Anthrax album. The songs are pretty great, but it is a little repetitive and there are a bit of chorus repeats, but this album doesn't have any major issues. Sound of White Noise is amazing. This is one of Anthrax's most musically brilliant albums, and is easily the best one with John Bush. This has everything I love about the John Bush era. It doesn't feel stupid, and it barely has any filler. This album is mostly grunge and alternative metal, with a few thrash elements. You can really hear the Alice in Chains on here, and they nailed that sound perfectly. The riffs are really good. The melodies sound amazing, and John Bush does a really amazing performance. His voice sounds really great on here. I would say the best tracks on here would be Only, Room for One More, Black Lodge, High Pro Glow, and my favorite song would have to be Invisible.
I'm wiping a slate, spotless, but I found it's just a final chance. Almost all the little faith has been thrown out the window. I promise to sustain my stance.
Overall, I really like this album. I like pretty much everything on here. I love this direction Anthrax went in, and I wish they sounded like this in the late 90s. Sound of White Noise is very good and underrated. Fistful of Metal. To me, this is easily the best Anthrax album. I fucking love this album. First of all, it has Anthrax's best vocalist, Neil Turbin. This guy is like Paul Stanley on meth. He has an outstanding vocal range. He can hit some very high notes, and I just love his voice in general. I wish they kept him. This album is pretty different from all of the other Anthrax albums. This isn't really thrash metal, it's more like speed metal and new wave of British heavy metal. You can definitely hear the Judas Priest in this album, and they nailed that sound. I generally love speed metal and traditional metal more than thrash metal or crossover, and that's really why this is my favorite Anthrax album, but the songs are insanely good. The riffs are very good. The soloing by Dan Spitz are probably his best solos ever. The drumming is awesome, and you already know Neil Turbin slays on here. This album has so many good tracks like Death Rider, Metal Thrashing Mad, Panic, Soldiers of Metal, and the best track has to be Subjugator.
Out in the streets, we're fighting tonight. We're dirty and mean, so run for your life.
This album is a masterpiece. I love everything about it, and I love the melodies and the traditional metal influence. Fistful of Metal fucking slays. So that was my ranking on all 11 albums from Anthrax. This band is pretty good, but I don't love them. I only really love Sound of White Noise and Fistful of Metal. Thank you guys for watching and subscribe for more videos.